The scar across Maya's chest looked like a roadmap to somewhere she'd never wanted to go. 3 months after the accident, the one that had turned her morning commute into a symphony of shattered glass and screaming metal. She stood before the bathroom mirror and traced the surgical lines with trembling fingers. The doctors had called it a miracle. 7 transplanted organs from 4 different donors. A medical marvel. She should have been grateful, they said, their voices bright with professional pride. She should have been dead. But gratitude was becoming difficult when your body no longer felt like your own. It started small, the way all terrible things do. A craving for black coffee, though she'd never drunk it before. Her hand reaching for the radio dial, bypassing her usual stations to land on classical music that made her weep for reasons she couldn't name. She told herself it was trauma, post-surgical stress, the mind's strange rebellion against its broken vessel. Then came the dreams. In them, she was 4 people at once. A pianist with arthritic hands practicing Rachmaninoff until her fingers bled. A construction worker named Marcus who died with a taste of cheap beer and cheaper regrets coating his tongue. A teenage girl who'd loved someone she shouldn't have, secrets lodged like shrapnel in her reconstructed lungs. An elderly woman who'd waited for death like an old friend, only to find herself scattered across another's flesh. Maya woke from these visions gasping, her skin slick with sweat that didn't smell like her anymore. 4 different scents now emanated from her pores, a chemical confusion her soap couldn't mask. The night she found herself playing Rachmaninoff, perfectly, impossibly, her fingers dancing across her neighbor's piano with muscle memory that wasn't hers, she finally understood. This wasn't psychological. This was cellular, biological, real. She returned to Dr. Chen, the surgeon who had stitched her back together like a broken doll. He ordered tests, his face grave as stone, and what they revealed painted her new reality in shades of medical impossibility. "Your DNA is changing," he said, the words falling between them like a diagnosis of doom. "The donor tissue isn't just integrating, it's converting, rewriting your genetic code, cell by cell." Maya's hands gripped the chair arms. Were those hands even hers anymore? "What does that mean?" she asked. Dr. Chen's silence was more eloquent than any explanation. In his eyes, she saw what he wouldn't say, that medicine had no protocol for this, no procedure, no cure, that she was becoming something science had no name for. The progression accelerated like a terminal illness gaining momentum. Each morning brought new foreign memories flooding her consciousness. Marcus's daughter's birthday, the pianist's first recital, the old woman's recipe for apple pie that made her weep, though she'd never baked in her life. They weren't just memories anymore. They were presences, distinct voices whispering in the caverns of her reconstructed chest. "We're still here," they seemed to say. "We never left." Maya started talking to them in the dark of her apartment, where no one could hear her fractured conversations. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "I didn't ask to be your cage, but the dead don't need permission to haunt the flesh they once called home." The night it happened, she stood before her mirror again, but the face looking back was no longer entirely hers. Her features shifted like water disturbed by stones. The pianist's aristocratic nose, Marcus's heavy brow, fragments of faces she'd never owned assembling themselves from her dissolving features. Inside her chest, her heart, the last organ that was truly originally hers, hammered against her ribs like something trapped and desperate. It beat out a rhythm of resistance, a Morse code of identity. I am Maya. I am Maya. I am... But the other organs were communicating now through her nervous system, a parliament of the dead voting on who would ultimately control this shared flesh. They pulsed in terrible synchronization, a conspiracy of donated parts overwhelming the original tenant. In the mirror, her eyes flickered between brown and blue and green. And Maya, the real Maya, felt herself becoming the minority shareholder of her own body, dissolving into the cellular democracy of the dead. The doctors had called it a miracle. They had no idea how right they were, or how wrong miracles could go. The accusation arrived like a virus, spreading through the digital bloodstream of social media with the speed and indifference of contagion. Thomas Hendricks hadn't hurt anyone. He was certain of this, the way he was certain of his own name, his own face in the mirror each morning. Yet there it was on his phone screen, a post claiming he'd assaulted someone at a party he'd never attended, in a city he'd never visited, on a date he could prove he'd been elsewhere. This will blow over, he told his reflection, but his reflection looked less convinced than it should have. The post went viral within hours, thousands of shares, tens of thousands. Each retweet was a nail in a coffin he didn't know was being built around him. The comment section became a courtroom where he wasn't allowed to testify, where the verdict had already been reached by anonymous jury members whose certainty grew more absolute with each passing minute. I always knew there was something off about him, someone wrote who'd never met him. He has that look, agreed another, and Thomas wondered what look that was, what his face had done to betray him into this narrative. He'd crafted his denial carefully, posted it everywhere he could, but denials are gossamer threads against the steel cable of collective belief. For every person who read his explanation, 100 more absorbed only the headline, the accusation, the delicious scandal of another monster unmasked. Then the world began to shift beneath his feet like sand surrendering to tide. It started with a phone call from his sister. "The police want to talk to you," she said, her voice carrying a new weight, a terrible doubt he'd never heard directed at him before. "They have evidence, Tom, security footage." "That's impossible," he said. But the word impossible was losing its meaning, becoming fluid, negotiable. The footage existed. He watched himself. His face, his gait, his jacket. Entering the building where the assault allegedly occurred, the timestamp matched. His own eyes stared back at him from the screen, frozen in pixelated certainty, and Thomas felt reality crack like ice beneath a heavy step. He'd never been there. He knew this. Yet the knowing was becoming slippery, difficult to hold. His apartment told stories he didn't remember writing. A receipt in his jacket pocket from a restaurant in that city, dated 2 days before the incident. Had that always been there? His credit card statement, when he checked with trembling hands, confirmed the purchase. The transaction sat there in black and white, as irrefutable as death. "No," he whispered to the empty room, but the room absorbed his denial like a sponge, offering nothing back. His memories began to fracture and reform like bones healing bent. He'd been at home that night, watching a movie. What movie? He couldn't remember now. The details were evaporating like water on hot pavement, leaving only residue, only doubt. In their place, new memories crept in unwanted. The drive to that city, the party, the terrible thing he knew he hadn't done, but could almost remember doing. The consensus was rewriting him from the outside in. At the police station, the detective laid out the evidence with the methodical precision of someone building an inescapable cage. Fingerprints, his fingerprints, on surfaces he'd never touched, witness statements describing him with uncanny accuracy, a paper trail of guilt that couldn't exist but did, manifesting from the collective belief of thousands who'd already convicted him in their minds. "I didn't do this," Thomas said, but his voice carried less conviction than before, as if the certainty was leaking out of him, replaced by the accumulated weight of everyone else's truth. The detective's eyes held something like pity, or perhaps recognition. "The evidence says otherwise, Mr. Hendricks." And there it was, the syllogism completing itself. If enough people believe it, reality bends to accommodate them. Everyone believes you're guilty, therefore you are. That night, alone in his apartment before they came to arrest him, Thomas sat in the dark and felt his own memories continuing their slow dissolution. The truth of his innocence was becoming harder to locate, a signal drowning in static, overwhelmed by the louder truth that everyone else believed. He wondered if, by the time the trial came, he would even remember being innocent, if the consensus would complete its work and rewrite him entirely, transforming him into the monster they all agreed he must be. In the darkness, his phone buzzed with another notification, another share. Another voice added to the chorus of belief. Reality rippled around him like disturbed water, and Thomas Hendricks, the innocent man, felt himself becoming the fiction that everyone had agreed was fact. The consensus had spoken. And in this world, the consensus was God. Dr. Sandra Palmer's shoes clicked against linoleum that gleamed like still water, reflecting the fluorescent lights above in long, wavering stripes. The corridor of Ward 7 stretched before her like a throat, narrow, white, endless. She'd been at Reasoning Municipal Hospital for 3 days, and already the building felt less like a place of healing and more like a machine that inhaled the broken and exhaled something else entirely. The patients troubled her, not because they were violent or incoherent. That would have been normal, expected, almost comforting in its familiarity. No, what disturbed Sandra was their perfect calm, the way they moved through the world like chess pieces across a board. Each action deliberate, calculated, yet somehow hollow. She found Mrs. Alvarez in the common room, sitting with geometric precision in a plastic chair. The woman's daughter had died 2 weeks ago. Car accident? Sandra had read the file. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Alvarez?" The woman looked up. Her eyes were clear, dry, utterly composed. "Loved ones should be mourned," Mrs. Alvarez said, her voice carrying the flat cadence of someone reading from a script. "My daughter was a loved one. Therefore, I am mourning." Sandra waited for tears that never came. Mrs. Alvarez's face arranged itself into an expression of sadness. The corners of her mouth turned down at the precise angle grief demanded, her eyebrows lifted in textbook sorrow. It was grief the way a photograph was grief, perfect, frozen, dead. "What was her name?" Sandra asked softly. Mrs. Alvarez blinked. "Daughters have names. She was my daughter. Therefore, she has a name." A pause, like a computer buffering. "Christina." The horror of it crept up Sandra's spine like cold fingers. Mrs. Alvarez had to reason her way to her own daughter's name. That evening, Sandra pulled patient files going back months, then years, then decades. The hospital's basement archive smelled of old paper and something else. Something sterile and patient that reminded her of laboratories where things were kept in jars. She worked by the light of a single bulb that swung slightly in the ventilation breeze, making shadows dance across boxes stacked like coffins. Every file told the same story. Patients arrived broken by trauma, depression, delusion. They underwent syllogistic reconditioning therapy. Dr. Marvin's famous treatment. They emerged calm, productive, cured, except they weren't cured. They were replaced. The files went back 90 years. Same treatment, same results. Different names, different faces, but always the same flat effect in the discharge notes. Patient demonstrates appropriate emotional responses through logical deduction. Sandra's hands trembled as she dug deeper, and that's when she found the journals. Dr. Marvin's personal notes from 1934, written in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic across yellowed pages. "The treatment works too well," one entry read. "We don't cure the illness, we cure the patient of being human. What remains follows the steps of feeling without the substance. They are philosophers' zombies. All behavior, no consciousness, but they function. God help me, they function better than before." A later entry dated 1942. "I wanted to stop. Tried to shut down the program, but the board wouldn't allow it. Too many success stories. Too many families grateful for their recovered loved ones and the patients. Once converted, they advocate for the treatment. Perfect logic dictates it. They're replacing us one syllogism at a time, and we're thanking them for it. The last entry was a single line. The treatment is mandatory for staff beginning next month. I will be first. Sandra heard footsteps on the stairs. That same deliberate, measured rhythm she'd heard from Mrs. Alvarez, from all the patients. She looked up to see Dr. Morrison, the hospital director, descending into the archive. His smile was precise, calculated to inspire trust at the exact degree required. Dr. Palmer, he said, and his voice had that same hollow quality. Employees concerned about institutional practices should undergo evaluation. You are an employee concerned about institutional practices. Therefore, you should undergo evaluation. Behind him, orderlies appeared. How many, Sandra couldn't tell in the swinging light. They moved like a syllogism taking physical form, inexorable, logical, completely certain. The therapy begins tomorrow, Dr. Morrison continued. You'll understand afterward. Premises lead to conclusions. Conclusions lead to peace. Therefore, premises lead to peace. Sandra backed against the shelves, files scattering like frightened birds. She tried to scream, but even that felt like just another premise waiting for its inevitable conclusion.